This is Mike Fry, and you are listening to the We Fucking Told You So podcast. Today is February 7th, 2025, and today's installment is titled, Vermont Governor Phil Scott Proves There Are No Decent Republicans Left. Before we get too deep into this edition of the We Fucking Told You So podcast, we have to start right out by saying that this edition is likely going to really piss off some of our fellow Vermonters. That's fine. Or maybe it's even good, because if one isn't pissed off right now, they probably aren't paying attention. We also want to say that Vermont is a spectacularly wonderful place to call home. What's not to love about Vermont? Vermont is Bernie Sanders, it's Ben and Jerry's, it's mountain and forest views as far as the eye can see, unobstructed by the trashy billboards found in the rest of the USA. Vermont is amazing farm-to-fork food, pristine waters, spectacular waterfalls carved through black granite and slate. Vermont is the kind of place where you'll be able to maybe see a burly lumberjack and a drag queen playing pool together at your local dive bar, where they serve up some of the best local microbrews in the nation for like $6 a pint. Vermont is neighborly, caring, and nurturing, and where Democrats have held a supermajority in the legislature for a long time, at least until the last election, and where they called Kamala Harris the winner in the last election with barely over 0% of the vote counted because it's just that progressive. But there's one thing that stands out as not being like the others. They have a Republican governor. Wait, what, you might ask? Yes, sure enough, Phil Scott, a Republican, became the 82nd governor of the state when he took office on January 5th, 2017. He's also been shockingly popular in a very progressive state. He therefore seems like a great test case as we ask the basic question about whether or not there are any decent Republicans left anywhere. Sadly, the answer clearly seems to be that there are none left. He certainly isn't one. Ask the typical Vermonter how they feel about Scott, and they all say almost exactly the same thing. They say, sure, he's a Republican, but not one of those Republicans. By emphasizing the word those, what they mean in Vermont speak is that he's not one of those Republicans who goes around making overtly racist, xenophobic, homophobic, and misogynistic statements so common with other Republicans. They mean Scott smiles, seems neighborly and non-aggressive, he's polished and talks a good game. He also volunteered a lot in the community, often very publicly. We could argue too publicly. The other thing that Vermonters like about Scott is his fiscal conservatism and focus on affordability, which speaks to our Yankee-style sense of frugality. Our state embraces making do with what you have, off-grid homesteading, and living minimalistically. Our state doesn't have much money to spend. The total population of the entire state is just under 650,000 people. In other words, it's smaller than a mid-sized major city. There isn't a lot of money to throw around, so Scott's fiscal policy speaks to many Vermonters for a number of reasons. There is, of course, a flip side to those policies, because regardless of the frugal mindset of the typical Vermonter, don't let that fool you into thinking there isn't money in Vermont. Vermont's ski industry alone brings more than 4.1 million tourists into the state annually and generates more than $1.6 billion in income. It's also a state where 16% of all houses are vacation homes, many of which are palatial second or third homes of uber-wealthy people from places like New York and New Jersey. There's also a dark side to all of that, because There's been a lot of consolidation in the ski industry, with outside investors from places like Vail buying more of it, and people buying second and third homes, particularly from out of state, contributes greatly to the housing crisis and affordability issues in Vermont. In a variety of ways, Scott's fiscal policies actually push money out of the state to people who really don't need it, hurting locals. It also doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that appropriately taxing the wealthiest people who are using and sometimes abusing Vermont's natural resources in order to stuff more cash in their already bulging wallets would pay for programs that Scott insists we can't possibly afford. In many ways, Scott is a typical Republican. For us, though, where the rubber really hits the road when asking the basic question of a person's decency is a person's position on MAGA and Felon 47. On that front, Scott has been either tepid, silent, or even condescending to anti-MAGA protesters, as was the case recently when hundreds of protesters showed up at the Capitol building in our hometown of Montpelier. Let's examine if Scott addressed any of the real legitimate horrifying concerns expressed by these protesters. Actually, we should call it a mass of protesters or a sea of protesters. For a town of just over 8,000 people, the hundreds of people who showed up, filling the sidewalk and stairs on a cold winter day, could also be described as a fuck ton of protesters. And to be clear, these protesters were expressing serious concerns about horrible things ranging from illegal raids without warrants, working to round up people who were just made illegal via executive order, shipping people to countries where they never lived, or imprisoning them at Guantanamo, illegally turning top-secret documents and private personal data of U.S. citizens over to an unelected oligarch with close ties to Russia, illegally shutting down federal payments, threatening federal employees and law enforcement, and even more absolute shit that can only be reasonably described as a fire hose of sewage spraying full force from the man we like to call the third Antichrist of Nostradamus. How did Scott respond to these real, serious, and legitimate concerns? Did he, Liz Cheney style, denounce these actions in the Republican Party that has sat quietly by watching what is clearly a coup in progress? Did he tell the crowd he would have their backs and help keep them safe from an uncontrolled tyrant as is his primary job as governor? Did he communicate even the slightest bit of compassion or empathy for the outrage and fear that they expressed? No. Nope. Instead, he mansplained to them. Quote, "We can't be outraged at every single thing that happens," he said. Let that sink in for a minute. We'll say it one more time. Quote, "We can't be outraged by every single thing that happens," end quote. In other words, the problem isn't the fire hose of illegal, abusive, and some would say traitorous actions being taken by the administration in just over 2 weeks' time. The real problem is the people protesting. They should be protesting the way he wants them to, which is probably not at all. Scott went on to say that we need a more measured approach to the new administration, as if we live in some alternate reality where this new administration would somehow be responsive to us if we were not quite so uppity. Scott also announced that he was forming a new task force to study the impact of the administration's proposed trade wars, which, are really bad, but probably one of the lesser problematic of the problems being protested by his own constituents. We also have to say that we are living examples of proof that, in fact, we can be outraged by every single thing that is happening because, in fact, we fucking are. All of the sane-washing, mansplaining, and gaslighting from our Republican governor isn't going to change that. And you know what we absolutely objectively and rationally cannot do, especially if we want to maintain a fiscal conservative approach to spending? We can't just form a fucking task force to study every single thing that is grossly unconstitutional, illegal, immoral, and reprehensible that is currently happening out of Washington. In the end, it's pretty clear that Scott is, in fact, one of those Republicans. He has just had a thin veneer hiding it from many good people of Vermont. We've seen through it all along, in spite of his popularity up until now. His mind-numbingly tone-deaf, ill-conceived, and non-response to what's been happening in his own party proves he's not what some people thought he was. When we look back at times like this in history, we think of people like Scott as being like the people who appeased the Nazis in Germany or silently sat by as their grotesque actions unfolded. Dr. King once wrote that the silence of well-meaning people was more memorable than the views of his opposition. And we think the Nazi appeasers were just as guilty as the Nazis back then. And just like the Nazi appeasers, people like Scott in his silence may never get the stench of Felon 47 off of him. No matter how much he tries to wash it off, the smell will likely remain for the rest of his life. And when he's voted out of office, we hope to see him on the Capitol stairs so we can look him right in the eyes, shake our heads, and say, "We fucking told you so." And clearly, there are no decent Republicans left anywhere. You have been listening to the We Fucking Told You So podcast. Please like and subscribe and share on your social media. Thanks for listening.